Our dog Max ran away from home and returned a year later, began on a quiet, cold autumn evening. Leaves rustled underfoot as our whole family, except for Max, gathered by the fireplace. The fire crackled, casting shadows on the walls, and the air was filled with the scent of cinnamon and hot chocolate. Max was always nearby, but that evening he was nowhere to be seen. "Where's Max?" asked Mom, looking up from her book. Dad shrugged, probably outside. "I'll go check." Dad opened the front door and cold air rushed into the house, making us all shiver. We heard Dad calling for Max, but there was no response. A minute later he returned, frowning. "He's nowhere to be seen. Maybe he ran after a squirrel or a cat. He usually comes back quickly, but Max didn't return that evening or the next day. We searched for him all over town, posted flyers and called shelters. Days turned into weeks and weeks into months. We began to lose hope, and the house settled into a silence once broken by the barking and pattering paws of our dog. A year passed. We still thought about Max from time to time, but our lives went on. Then one day, on the eve of the anniversary of his disappearance, Dad came home with a surprised look on his face. "I think I saw Max," he said, closing the door. "I was at the market and suddenly saw a dog that looked a lot like ours. I tried to approach him, but he ran away." This news gave us hope. The next day we went to the market again, but the dog wasn't there. We began to search the surrounding areas, and a few days later, as dusk fell, we saw him. Max stood at the edge of the forest, his eyes glowing in the dark like two small coals. We called to him, but he didn't move. Finally, after much coaxing, he slowly approached us. We were so happy that we didn't immediately notice that something had changed in our dog. Max returned home, but with him came something dark, something inexplicable. At first it was barely noticeable. He avoided the light and spent most of his time curled up in a corner of the room. His eyes no longer shone with joy. There was something strange, something alien in them. Gradually, more oddities occurred. Max began to bark at night, his bark deep and menacing, filling the house with a strange unease. He dug holes in the yard, but we could never understand why. It seemed he was searching for something, or maybe burying something. One night I woke up to a strange noise. The floorboards creaked, and there was a quiet growl from the hallway. I cautiously stepped out of my room and saw Max standing by the basement door. His eyes glowed red and a chill ran down my spine. He looked at me with such hatred that I froze in place. "Max," I whispered, but he only growled and continued scratching at the door. In the morning, I told my parents about it, but they just brushed it off as a dream. However, the oddities continued. Max spent more and more time in the basement, and his behavior became increasingly sinister. He grew aggressive, and we started to fear him. One night, Mom went down to the basement to check on Max. She didn't come back. Dad and I found her sitting on the floor, her eyes empty, muttering something incomprehensible. She didn't recognize us and kept repeating one word: darkness. We called the doctors, but they couldn't explain what had happened. Mom never regained her senses, and soon she was admitted to the hospital. After that, Dad and I decided we had to do something about Max. We called a priest to bless the house, but when he approached Max, the dog lunged at him with such fury that the priest barely managed to escape. Then we realized that something terrible had taken possession of our dog. Dad suggested we put Max to sleep, but I couldn't agree. He was still our dog, despite all the oddities and threats. We continued living in fear, unable to take drastic measures. Soon Dad became withdrawn with dark circles under his eyes. He spent a lot of time in the basement, but never told us what he was doing. We hardly spoke, each consumed by our own fears and worries. One night I woke up to a strange rustling sound. Max stood by my bed, his eyes glowing in the dark. A chill ran through my veins. I realized that he was no longer our dog, but he had become something else. From that day on, I noticed that something had changed in the house. The walls seemed alive, making strange sounds, and at night I heard whispers that seemed to come from the basement. I knew it was Max or whatever now inhabited his body. One evening, when Dad went to the hospital to visit Mom, I was home alone. The house was quiet, but I felt Max's presence. Suddenly I heard the floorboards creak. I slowly got up and walked into the hallway. Max stood by the basement door, his eyes glowing, and fear gripped me. "What do you want?" I asked, but the answer was only a growl. He began to descend into the basement, and I followed him. When I reached the basement, I saw him digging a hole. Strange symbols hung on the walls, and I realized that this wasn't Mac. It was something that had taken over his body and now tried to break into our world. I gathered all my courage and approached him. At that moment, Max turned and growled. I knew that if I didn't stop him now, it would be too late. I found an old rusty chain and lunged at him. Max began to thrash and struggle, but I didn't give up. Eventually, I managed to chain him to the wall. His eyes burned with hatred, but he couldn't break free. I spent the night in the basement, keeping watch, and in the morning I called the priest. Together we performed an exorcism, and I felt the darkness leave the house. Max stopped growling and collapsed on the floor. Unconscious, when he woke up, his eyes were normal again. He approached me and licked my hand. I knew that our Max was back. We spent a lot of time cleansing the house and getting rid of anything that reminded us of those dark days. However, after a few days, I began to notice that something was wrong with Dad. He became increasingly gloomy and withdrawn, avoiding contact. One night, I heard him talking to himself in the basement. I quietly went down and saw him standing in front of those same symbols we had erased from the walls. He was repeating them, drawing something on the floor. "Dad?" I whispered, and he turned. His eyes were empty, like Mom's that fateful night. "Darkness," he whispered. "It hasn't left. It's inside me." I knew this was the end. Max was only the beginning, the harbinger of what was to come. Dad, our protector and support, was now an instrument of this darkness. That night I heard his screams, his struggle with himself. I didn't dare leave my room knowing I couldn't help. In the morning I found his body in the basement among the same symbols he had drawn during the night. He had sacrificed himself to stop the darkness, but it hadn't left. I was left alone in this house full of shadows and whispers. Max, our faithful dog, sat next to me, his eyes once again glowing that red light. I realized that this would never end. The darkness had found a new home in our house, and it would never let us go.